Alright, welcome back to the Recipe Analyst. Today I'm going to be making the multi-purpose dough from Joshua Weissman's An Unapologetic Cookbook. And to start, I'm going to have to make the tangzong, which is just a mixture of flour, milk, and water. And once I have all of that in a pot, I can go ahead and whisk it together. Once it's all whisked together and homogeneous, I put it over medium heat and then I stir it continuously until a thick paste forms. So that takes a few minutes, but if you keep stirring, you'll get a paste like this. Then I transfer it to a small bowl to cool while I heat up some water and milk for the yeast. So I just put that over medium heat for a few minutes, and I did overshoot it a little bit. We're aiming for 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the meantime, I put the yeast in a separate container. Once it cooled off a little bit, I whisked in the yeast. While the yeast was blooming, I got the dry ingredients ready to go in the bowl of the stand mixer. So it's just the flour, the sugar, and some salt, and I weighed it all out on a scale to make it as accurate as possible. Of course, you have to whisk that together before you add everything else into it. And while the yeast was still blooming, I decided to go ahead and microwave the butter to get it softened, or you can just leave the butter out for a few hours to soften it up to make it incorporate into the dough a little bit easier. I add the dough hook to the stand mixer and I put it on a medium-low speed, and then I start adding all the ingredients one at a time. So I started off with the yeast mixture. As you can see, it foamed up a little bit. Make sure you get all of that in there. And then I add a whole egg. Then I separate the yolk from another egg, and I just use the shells to pass the yolk back and forth between the two to get as much of the white out as possible. And I add that to the dough. And once the dough starts to come together, I can add the tangzong that's been cooling for a little bit. And here I just increase the speed a little bit. Now I'm gonna check on the dough. It's supposed to be pretty smooth, so I let it go for a little bit longer. At this point, it looks a lot smoother than it was before. Now I can add the butter and then continue to mix it until the butter is pretty much fully incorporated. While that's going, I'm preparing the bowl, just greasing it, as well as some plastic wrap so that it doesn't stick. Now I transfer the dough to the bowl, cover it with the plastic wrap, and then after an hour, this is what the dough looks like. So it's about doubled in size. Now I'm gonna prepare my work surface to form the dough into some buns and transfer it to a parchment paper lined baking sheet. I degas it with my fist, just pressing it so most of the gas is released from the dough. And then I transfer it to that floured work surface. And then I separate it into about 7 evenly sized balls. Now to form the buns, I take each piece and then I pull the outsides into the inside like this. And then I put it on the work surface and roll it in circles pretty much to tighten up the surface before I transfer it onto the parchment paper lined baking sheet. Then I do that for the rest of them. Then I cover it with a damp towel and I let it proof for about 30 minutes. And after 30 minutes, they've risen significantly, about doubled in size. Now I can brush them all with some egg wash or just some whipped egg. And I ended up baking these for about 22 minutes. The recipe says 15 minutes, but they were a little pale, so I let them go for a little bit longer. I let them cool on the baking sheet for a little bit before I transferred them to a cooling rack, and then at that point they're pretty much done. So I use these buns primarily for some homemade chicken sandwiches, and I made chicken patties from scratch. So how did they turn out? I think the texture is the most impressive thing about these buns. They're very soft, and they have a nice chew to them, but they're not tough by any means. They just have a nice texture in your mouth. So when you put them together in a sandwich, you don't have any trouble biting through any of the ingredients. And the flavor is pretty neutral. So whatever you have in your sandwich will be the star of the show. And you don't have to really worry about the bread overpowering any of your ingredients. So I decided to give this recipe a 7 out of 10. It wasn't anything exceptional, but I think it's a pretty solid bun recipe or bread recipe, and you could use this for a lot of different things. So if you give it a try, I don't think you'll be disappointed. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you have any recommendations for other recipes you want me to try, you can let me know, and I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. Thanks again.